Hey, what's up? Welcome back to another new episode of What's Up Conversations. Sorry I wasn't around for quite some time. Been working on lots of exciting projects, but hey, we're back to the routine, I hope. Gotta make an announcement. I've partnered up with SatGarMe.com, a cool video game website, and they are supporting the show, and hopefully things will get even better. Alright, let's go and talk about this episode. Boy, oh boy, I had an awesome chat with Jordan Thomas, writer and director of BioShock 2. And since it was the 10th anniversary of that game, I thought it would be fun to talk to him about the behind scene of that game and his entire career. Designing games like Thief, Deadly Shadows, all the BioShocks, Ken Levine, his newest studio Question Games, and of course the Blackout Club. This conversation was really exciting and full of history and new revelations. I've already done an episode with Ken Levine, so make sure to listen to that too if you're into BioShock. Alright, before going to the conversation, just wanted to make an announcement like Bernie Sanders. I'm once again asking for your financial support. No, man, no need for financial support, but your spiritual support. Just hit subscribe, follow, or whatever you do on your app listening to this conversation. That would help a lot, and make sure to share this podcast with anyone you might think would be interested. You can keep up with this podcast on my Twitter handle at @HRNikufar, Nikufar with double O and K. Thank you. Let's go and listen to the chat. Welcome to What's Up Conversations, Jordan. How are you doing?
I'm good. It's morning here.
So it's the 10th anniversary of BioShock 2, a game that you wrote and directed back in 2010. When you're looking back at it, what is the first vivid memory you have making that game?
I had been in Australia, in Canberra, at 2K's studio there, working on a draft of what would eventually become the Bureau. And what shipped was unrecognizable, completely different, not what I had pitched. But I was one of several people who was working on an iteration of that game, and it had already gone through a couple by the time I arrived. And I thought I was going to live in Australia. And then Alyssa Finley, who had been the executive producer of BioShock 1 and who sat right next to me throughout that game, called me up and said, "We want to offer you creative director on BioShock 2. And, at first I didn't really understand, right? Because the IP was going to be moving from Irrational to 2K in California.
Yeah.
And, after I picked through some of the specifics with her about the timeline and so forth, I of course began to think of it as an offer I couldn't refuse. And so my first instinct was, oh wow, I'm gonna have to fly all the way home, and I hope I come up with a game pitch on the way.
Yeah. So I was 19 when that game came out, and recently I beat the game again, and I gotta say it's aged pretty well. So we'll come back to BioShock, but let's go back when you were just a kid growing up loving games. Where'd you grow up, and tell me about the games you played during the Teenagehood, and how did you get into the video game industry?
So I moved from Seattle to Olympia, Washington, the capital of the state of Washington, when I was, I think, around 3. I don't really remember that particularly. And grew up in Olympia, and my father was an early adopter of various PC hardware. He went through a few different iterations, like the Coleco Atom and these kinds of very old machines, before settling on the IBM PC Junior. And it sort of would later, I think it would be kind of a harbinger of what would be true later, which is that games owe a great debt to sound and music that they infrequently recognize. And the PC Junior had a complicated, for its time, sound card. And so as a result, the games just seemed to pop, right, in ways that they hadn't previously. And so we had a series of mainly Sierra adventure games that started on the PC Junior, and then eventually we would get more sophisticated machines as time would go on. And Sierra built these very point and click Well, actually, at that time, they were text parsers. You would type in what you wanted to do, and the character would act it out. And of course, there were many, many, many wrong answers. You had to guess what the designer must have been thinking, and feed it phrases. And sometimes they would come up with humorous responses. You could curse at it, and it would have something witty to say. And I think that connection, that sense of, okay, there's a virtual space on the other side of this screen. You can tell a story this way, and the graphics became more and more kind of enchanting and kind of storybook. Something diverged. My parents had always thought I would go into movies. I was making animated films with clay and puppetry at the time, which was very, very popular back then. There were big, animation houses that were actually making decent money doing claymation, and that has since largely fallen away with the rise of CG. And I think at that moment, a switch was flipped, and I started to think, I want to do this. And the only other, I think, relevant thing, without going on too long, about the childhood is that I always sort of had the confidence to convince people to do things, and I have always needed to spend double time trying to learn any of the technical aptitudes that seem to come naturally to them. So when I was 15, I convinced a group of people, two of whom were double my age, to build a little video game with me, and it was kind of like trying to bring digital feedback to the tabletop game experience. And I didn't really know, who the audience would be for. It felt like it would be like for people like me, and they were really into it. And it was still shocking to me that they listened to a 15-year-old kid to build assets for it. And eventually we ran up against a technical wall. My good friend, was not yet a sophisticated enough programmer to do everything that we wanted to do. And it petered out like many things do, but it was an early point on a line towards the idea that maybe if I could advocate the ideas strongly enough, people would listen, and we would execute. And eventually that would become true. It just took many, many years.
Yeah. So it was back in '80s, I guess, right?
Yes. Really, that would have been the '90s. I grew up in the '80s as an actual child, and then the '90s was when I gained enough literacy with computers to start making things with them. And programming languages like Visual Basic and things like this. There were some alternate programs available in my high school that you could go and learn computer programming from a local vocational school. And it wasn't, the instructor wasn't really, all that coherent. And so largely we played games, but that would still all prove formative. I still learned what I wanted to make and what I didn't. But it also led me to want to, as I say, like start my own company. And granted, it was a little bit naive, but there were skills built along the way. That was in the '90s.
So what was the first huge game that you were involved in making?
Well, that depends on whether you mean sales or critical acclaim, because sales-wise, I guess there's a caveat. So I worked as a script editor when writing in games was often derided and thought of as a kind of almost like plumbing, just get the job done. I worked as a script editor. I was hired by Signosis out of my game journalism job to edit the script for a game called Draken, which was sort of a Tomb Raider-like fantasy adventure where you played a young woman who could ride on the back of a dragon. And at the time, actually flying a dragon around was a huge leap forward in technology. And so the script it needed some work. And I edited as much as I could, although there were, much of it had already been recorded, and so there wasn't a whole lot that could be done. And I ultimately did not get a job from that company as a designer because I was mostly focused on the writing, and honestly, their design tools were baffling to me. And so I was interning with them at the same time that their publisher was hiring me to edit their script, which was very awkward. And so I left that place and Psygnosis collapsed. Psygnosis, that made Lemmings and these kind of games. It collapsed as a publisher, and all my contacts disappeared. And so I ended up working for Microsoft in QA for a while. And I learned 3D tools on the Encarta software project. They had an Encarta virtual tourism kind of thing where you would go to different foreign locations and learn the language, with ridiculous full motion video people asking you language questions. But they still needed environments, right? So we would do a terrible French restaurant or a terrible Spanish beach or whatever, and it would look like garbage. But it forced us to learn texturing and modeling and these things, and so I used that to get a job at Amaze Entertainment, who made largely games for kids, I think, with a couple of exceptions. And so the first really big seller I worked on was I had only 6 months to learn Unreal, working for them to ship Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone for the PC. And it was a crash course, but very tight bonds formed. Bizarrely, 9/11 happened during that time.
Oh yeah.
And we all just kind of kept working because we were bewildered nerds and didn't know what to do. And I wanted to work at Ion Storm Austin, who had made Deus Ex, and from my perspective, that was utterly revolutionary. I couldn't imagine a game that was better suited to my interests, perhaps than Thief. And between Thief and Deus Ex, they were my kind of twin favorites. And this studio had a hold of both of them. They were going to make sequels to both of them. And I applied once, came off overconfident for Microsoft, didn't get it. Shipped a game, having learned Unreal, and suddenly, I was a better value proposition, and they hired me then. And that was really the start of my career as we know it now, because that was the first what they call immersive simulation game that I had anything to do with.
So you
anyway,
were
that's a long answer.
Yeah, so you were the lead designer in Thief Deadly Shadows, and that game was praised for its horror levels, and I'm guessing that you were responsible for those horror elements, am I right?
So Randy Smith, who was the creative director of that project at the time, is also a lifelong horror fan, and I think it's one of the reasons that we connected. So my initial job was just level designer. I was hired, as fairly junior still. I was in my 20s somewhere, and I was put in charge of what would later become the scary level in that game. It was at the time it was just called Haunted House. It eventually became called the Shieldbridge Cradle, this orphanage turned lunatic asylum. And I just threw myself at it. I lived game development so utterly that it was almost cult-like. And I was there all the time. I cared only about the quality of the game, and I met the team and became trusted by them because they could just see that whatever the problem was, I would solve it by burning my own energy. And at some point, they realized they needed somebody to lead the designers, and so they interviewed a few of us from within, and I got the job. And then my relationship with Randy became, I think, even more fertile for a while there because we were on the same page about what was needed, and I was happy to represent him in the trenches. And then some tension started to rise between himself and the studio head at the time, and he left before the project concluded. And at that point, people sort of naturally looked to me, and I became more of a leader and had to step up and finish the game. And I'm credited quite often with some of the successes of that game, but I frequently tell them that as a lead designer, I largely finished what Randy started. What I'm most proud of is my level design and my influence on the game's horror.
Yeah, that would have been great. I mean, you worked on your favorite game suddenly. That's great. So
it was hard to transition it to console because it was definitely a very, very PC oriented game. But we did our best, and there's certainly some very memorable parts of it.
yeah. Do you think they're ever gonna make another great Thief again? Have you played the reboot that was released back in I guess 2014? What do you think about it?
I think that franchise mentality will never die, and because the overused phrase that is still quite accurate is in the attention economy. Getting people to simply notice that you've got a new game coming out is becoming increasingly difficult, and so one of the only inroads to do that is brand recognition.
Yeah.
So even though the remake, or not the remake, but Thief 4, whatever you want to call it, was a release with some problems. I think it's likely that at some point people's minds will get sort of a rose. Will put on their rose-colored glasses, and they'll start to think, "What about another Thief?" Like that's how it happens. But the economic model will probably have to change before that occurs. Like you maybe charging $60 for a Thief game is the wrong move, and they should go for something more intimate, lower price point.
Yeah. What do you think is the main ingredient of making a great Thief game?
I think it's voyeurism. And I know that sounds a little controversial in a way, but I don't mean it to be. The best of the Thief games make you feel very much like you are truly in somebody's house and should not be. And you're almost frozen by how alive it seems and how near you are to getting caught. There's a very almost perverse thrill associated with playing a Thief game well, and walking past people in their rooms while they're sleeping. Like that stuff is charged. That's why it may not be 100% for everybody. In addition to the how swingy they have been in the past, where when you fail, the game tends to get a lot less fun, right? You get chased and then you die. They've tried to solve that variously, but it remains part of the tension that makes the tension so sweet is the knowledge of coming consequences, so it's hard to banish that completely. But prior to that moment, prior to everything going wrong, there's something just intoxicating about feeling like you're just around the corner, or you're hiding behind the door as the guy opens it, and this kind of stuff. And I think that it puts people in their bodies physically. I remember my whole from my spine to my skull kind of drawing up and binding together when I would get too near a ledge in Thief, because the sound design was so good, and I feared the sound of him hitting the ground so much that it felt I was there, and very few games have made me feel that way since, as physical, I guess, and you're leaning and climbing and mantling and all these things, and every little move counts, as opposed to the sort of loose and cheap power that you get in a lot of other games where you might as well be a motorcycle.
Yeah. I hope they make another great Thief. Yeah. Let's pivot the conversation to Ken Levine, an inevitable factor in most of your interviews. Do you remember the first time meeting him, and how was it?
Yeah. I was once again contracted by a publisher, to help staff up a project. I had finished up the Thief games and had been through a startup that didn't really go anywhere because the people who were financially backing it weren't really prepared to follow through. They were kind of a serious games company that was dabbling in entertainment, and I ended up contacted by Tim Perry, who had worked on Thief 3 and had become since a figure in 2K publishing. And he said, "Look, they need design support here. What are you up to?" And I didn't necessarily relish the idea of returning to level design because it felt like a demotion. But I also love it. I deeply love it. And that game was so exciting. And I, System Shock 2 changed my life. And so I thought, okay, humble yourself, man. Go work with these people. That's all that really matters. And I went out to Boston, or Quincy, which is a suburb of Boston, and And I sat down with Ken, and he's sort of he's got almost like a Broadway New York kind of patter to his voice. Like I hadn't met a lot of people like him, and so it just struck me as a character already. And he talked to me about where he thought the state of the game was. He said that, he felt that it wasn't scary. I talked a lot about System Shock 2 with him, and he said he felt it wasn't scary enough. I said I thought I could help with that. And he said, we've got this level with an artist who has become psychotic through the use of these plasmids that he's spliced into his DNA. But that really the plasmids are just an accelerant of what's already there. It takes the things that were already wrong with these people and exaggerates them. And I love that. And he says that he's got these complicated relationships with his former proteges. He's definitely kind of groomed them and then slept with them and then rejected them, and now they all loathe him. And they have been chased off into different corners of his domain, and he wants you to kill them and build a sculpture out of their bodies, or somehow represent them. And in the meantime, since that conversation, the camera mechanic had come online, and it became more about taking photographs. But I was very much into horror, and that all sounded exactly up my alley. And I loved the idea that through the participation in this level, that the themes of it would be expressed down in the lowest of the mechanics, that you're physically making a kind of macabre art while dealing with a macabre artist. And that he is very obviously grooming you in the same way that he did with them, and that has its own kind of drama and delicious kind of sort of a intrigue, I suppose. And I just went all out. I wanted to beat the Shellbridge Cradle, which is sort of a weird thing to think. It wasn't the same kind of game, whatever. But I wanted to make something that would be remembered. And it's just, I get very ambitious, and I want, my level to be almost a game worth of content. And that people have criticized me for that, and I understand in hindsight, because I tend to draw a lot of resources towards that vision and so forth. But ultimately, most of it was just work, just very hard work of many hours, trying to get things right. And the team seemed to respond well to that, right? Because I believed. I've always believed. And so, yeah. Anyway, that you just asked how I met him. There you go. Very long answer.
Yeah, I remember the first time talking to Ken, and he told me to never meet your heroes because they often disappoint you. But years have gone by, and he's still one of the kindest people I know in my life. And I think Ken is wrong with that idea, at least in my case, because I often find my heroes more inspiring when I speak with them, and they are just, especially when they're themselves. And I think those are some key elements of being a great leader, which I think this is true about you too, because I didn't know a lot about you before this conversation, but I went online and watched your previous interviews, and I was like, he's a cool guy. I know I'm gonna have a fun talking about games with him, and I'm sure people at Question Games share the same opinion. So I guess it's a good time to talk about leadership in video games. So what's different between leading a huge corporate project like BioShock and leading a relatively small and indie team like Question?
Well, there are two main differences. First, on a project like BioShock, there's a phase of the development cycle called Blue Sky, or it was called Blue Sky when I was around. And the thought there is to go as ambitious as you possibly can. No idea is wrong. Reach for the stars. Talk about every possible outlandish feature that you might want in the game. Dream big. And what that tends to lead to is that people get very almost married to a feature that emerges during the blue sky phase, where they're encouraged to think without their inner critic. And the intent behind this is somewhat wholesome, in the sense that there are people whose inner critic is so strong that they won't say anything unless somebody encourages them to dream big. But there are other people who don't need that that goading whatsoever, and so they decide to make a given feature their personal cause. And later, when it becomes clear that yes, even a game with multiple millions of dollars as the budget has limits, they sort of they find their will to create eroding, and their investment tends to fall apart, and that's kind of a shame. With an indie shop, those constraints are pretty obvious from the word go. You know, you have a certain number of heads, you have whatever technology you've got your time and your budget, but they are so much smaller that you must immediately start saying no to yourself in any along any line of discussion that doesn't speak to the core, right? Find out whatever your game is about and cut everything else as soon as you possibly can. And even on the Blackout Club, I would argue that we probably didn't do that well enough, because the three company owners really love to get along with one another. We primarily want to keep each other happy, and what that means is we don't love saying no to each other. And so each of us had things that were important to us, and they all kind of made it into the game, and individually they probably would have been more polished. But anyway, you know, we still had to dump a lot of things. Like a perfect example is I would have loved to put dogs in the Blackout Club, and we just, you know, early on I was like, no, that's not a human skeleton. We can't reuse the animations. It's going to be, you know, memory and other kind of challenges. And so very early on I was told that's not going to work. On a AAA game, that dog feature would have been cut in year 2 after costing a lot of people's time and energy. So I hope that kind of sums it up. That it has certainly a lot to do with scope, and then secondly, and more simply, a lot of indie companies, and ours is absolutely this way. People are distributed; they work from home. There's a few that are lucky enough to have an office where they can all pile into, or maybe they're students or something like that. But in our case, like many others, we meet through a tool called VC that was made for surgeons, and it's peer-to-peer video conferencing. It's not perfect, but it does some things that other things do not. The tools do not, and that can be a challenge, right? You have to account for how strange it is to talk to people over video, and you have to double and triple check that people's feelings are not being suppressed just because they don't want to be a bother, or vice versa, that somebody's not being too snippy and kind of callous because they have the distance of video between them and the person they're talking to. It can cause lots of different personality conflicts. So we have to double and triple check that everybody's still on board and that they're saying what they mean, even though we're remote.
Oh, that's interesting. How many people are you at? Question.
Well, we're up to around 12, and we are growing all the time. We have contractors, so that number varies, but and we intend to keep growing, but we like to do so slowly because that, as I just mentioned, team fit is so vital, right? They have to be able to deal with all of those things and still remain more or less a person with a conscience.
And how many people were involved in BioShock 2?
Oh boy, I think we ended. I want to say in the 80s of team members across the studios, and then a number of contractors beyond that. If you counted the team at Digital Extremes, I'm sure it would have been well over 100.
Wow. So let's talk about BioShock 2. I was playing the game for the second time, and I was constantly thinking about the possible pressures you had making that game. It was a sequel to one of the best games in the history, which was written by a man with a lot of personal opinions about philosophy and politics. BioShock 2 was made by many studios and people, and I guess managing that is a nightmare of its own. And I'm very curious to know about the feelings and pressure you had during the development of that game. How did you start a sequel to BioShock?
Yeah, I mean, it started off relatively optimistic because we had a handful of people who had shipped the first game, and we always could talk to one another quite casually about our experiences. And it hadn't been that long, and so we felt that we had enough of the spirit of the series, that it would not it was about to become a series, in our minds and our hearts, I suppose. But we also said to ourselves that we were going to be, I don't know, nicer. That the company was going to be founded on a kind of a concept as broad and as brow raising as love. You know, like I think the interview that we did right after the studio was founded, like we had watched maybe too much Firefly, and was talking about how it was powered by love. But and you know, we still were a relatively civil studio to one another, but you know, things got dark, as they often do. And in answer to the main part of your question, I mean, the pressure was overwhelming. I could not. It was going from, you know, a level and lead designer to a creative director. It's a very different scale. You know, you're interacting with publishing for one, and out of the gate, they said you've got 2 years and you have to ship a PlayStation SKU of BioShock 1 with the same team.
Wow.
And you have to have multiplayer, like out of the gate. And so that led to the producers telling me that we had to be set in Rapture as well. And that's not at all what I would have done. You know, like
Really?
Oh yeah, no.
You would have gone with a new city?
We might have shown Rapture as rendered by the minds of one of the characters. But yeah, like in my mind, but you know, and you know, listen, like this, you may disagree, but in my mind, BioShock is about taking you somewhere you don't expect. And from the very beginning, and so I very much wanted to do a city that had a different philosophy at its heart, but that was not realistic. And so the question became, okay, well, if we're going to tell a Rapture story, you know, what can we do that is not going to feel played out and done? And my original proposal was about a little sister returning to Rapture. You'd be playing a little sister, and it'd be much more of a horror-oriented pace and vulnerability, closer to Thief, frankly. And I was told, no, we want this to be our Gears of War. This needs to be a big shooter franchise with an emphasis on the shooter. And I said, okay. And so what I think of the protagonist of a shooter as is a big lumbering sort of porthole on a stick with guns sticking out the front. Like, is it you know, you're almost a vehicle. Really, if you were to watch a first-person shooter protagonist move, it's hilarious. It doesn't seem like a person at all. And so I thought, okay, well, then we can at least talk about the relationship between the big daddies and the little sisters, and you'd play a big daddy. And so finally, after multiple rounds of well, that doesn't quite fit, we settled on that, which they were willing to accept. And the big daddies, they kept using the word iconic, which would later be so continually abused by games marketing. But they thought of the big daddy as iconic, and they're not wrong. Like, certainly the first trailer made a very strong impression on people. We went with our own design because, you know, the way the player moved didn't seem like something with a giant, you know, golf ball for a head. But it was fun. It was people got into the fantasy of being a protector pretty quickly, and it seemed to build its own momentum.
Yeah. So where did you have in mind for BioShock 2 initially, if it wasn't Rapture?
Oh, well, it would have been a utilitarian utopia based on the idea of minimizing suffering. So some people would say kind of more communist. I don't know that utilitarians must always be communist, but they absolutely are, about making sure that the rich and the poor have their equal share of suffering and their equal share of pleasure. Utilitarianism is sort of all about looking at pain and trying to make sure that pain is minimized. And what that usually means is equalizing of everything. Oh. And so it was very much like the little sister sequence near the end. It was white and red and curved and more Art Nouveau than Art Deco, and all about trying to protect you from yourself. It was sort of like the nanny state gone wrong, the opposite of what Andrew Ryan would want. Saving you from yourself, and that. I love writing that kind of overbearing villain that knows better than you and is going to fix you. They don't want to hurt you. They're not looking to put you in pain, but the pain comes from the distance between their vision and yours. They think you are a child and children must be protected, even if they themselves protest. That kind of villain I find really appealing, because I think there's a lot more texture in that than just, you're going to die and I will make you suffer.
Yeah. So geographically, how did you imagine BioShock 2?
We talked about a couple of different things. We talked about floating on the surface of the sea. We talked about a flying city, just like what would later be the third game. We talked about space. That part of it didn't get super far. Eventually we resettled. Like, last version of that pitch that existed was that it would still have been underwater and would have sort of it would have been the parasite that Andrew Ryan talks about so often in a philosophical sense in the first game, that they would have moved in after Rapture collapses nearby, kind of floating over it like a space station, but underwater, hanging in space.
Yeah. So that would have been a very exciting BioShock. So BioShock 1 was dealing with individualism, but the second one was talking more about collectivism. How did you create the philosophy behind BioShock 2? And what was your main sources of inspiration for that game?
So John Stuart Mill and Peter Singer are sort of the earliest glimmers of the utilitarian philosophy, and then its manifestation in the 70s as pertains to animal rights and stuff like this. So reading their works and those of several other people, Pierce, I think, Pearce, all wonderful takes on how to spread suffering so thinly that it is bearable. Everybody doing their part, everybody dividing the problem. And then specifically with Peter Singer, he was all about like, well, what about animal suffering, right? And he was connecting utilitarianism to that. And so I thought that Andrew Ryan would hate that, right? And so it seemed as far from objectivism as you could go. And it also, if you look at utilitarianism, it doesn't necessarily lead to communism, right? And it was interesting to me to try to pinpoint what was the difference between utilitarianism and communism. But a lot of people didn't understand that difference on the team and in real life. And so what we did was write that in. You know, a lot of Ryan's people call Lamb and her followers communists, and she's sort of she's too high and mighty to stoop to correct them. And then they project religion onto her, and she doesn't stop them, because by that point she's become kind of hypocritical.
Yeah. Did you have any consult with Ken during production of BioShock 2?
Yeah, a few calls, but he was very, I think that the emotions of the fact that the second BioShock game existed at all and was not happening in his house were very complicated for him, and so he was very cordial with me, but contact was limited by forces that I was not directly aware of, and I asked him, for his opinions on a few things. He certainly sounded encouraging and interested at the differences. And then specifically, I called him whenever I felt like I had to touch BioShock 1 canon, during the party in 1959 and, who was where and what was happening, things that are not seen in the audio logs. I did an absurd amount of research. I absorbed the script of the first game back front and center. But then there were still holes and gaps about intent. And I wanted to ask about where something might fit if it had to. And he indulged it, again, in a cordial way. Like I said, I think it was all emotional for him. And I was relatively young still and under a lot of pressure. And so all I wanted to do was solve the problem. And so I'm sure those phone calls from his perspective were like, what?
So how would you feel if someday someone come up and say, hey, we want to make a sequel to Blackout Club, but without you?
I mean, I would say good luck, because the Blackout Club is an example of a game that even a lot of the team members are like, this is a little too mysterious. What does this mean? What is this part? Like, who is this god and what do they want? And it's so cryptic and so kind of cosmic horror or eldritch or whatever you want to say for something that you're never supposed to know all of the answers in full. That I would find the results of their work hilarious, and I would just say good luck. I've been in the industry too long to imagine that would never happen. And so I would try to just sort of take it in stride and enjoy it.
So in cinema, we often say that this or that film is a personal film from a specific director. In games, we don't hear that a lot. Why is that? I mean, making films and making games are both a teamwork. What makes a game personal and what makes another one just a product?
That's an interesting question, because I think that the answer around the era that BioShock 2's team was being put together was, the way to make it personal is to make sure that there is a singular vision keeper, and they're going to pretend to be Stanley Kubrick, and they're going to involve themselves in every aspect, and therefore their personality and their biases and their drives and their artistic integrity will be infused into it. And that doesn't work very well for games, both because the teams are much larger and the teams are intended to still exist after the project is done, and movies aren't. In a lot of cases, they've got like a core group, but largely the rest of them roll off. And then secondarily, because the role of the player comes in and the player does things that the artist doesn't expect. And the role of the viewer of a movie, there's only so much they can do. They can not understand, or they can understand. They can be moved or not moved. But their feedback, a lot of people would say, is of questionable use during the process of a film. There's feedback on the script, and that's where all of that happens. And script feedback is relatively cheap. With games, they're grown on the fly. If you write down the entire script to begin with, that script will be unrecognizable by the time you ship the game. And so it is difficult to force too much of your own personality onto something that grows many heads and sort of tells you what it wants to be, like most large scale video games do. Indie games, by contrast, are often made by fewer people for fewer resources in less time. And so the deviation of the vision is not as much room for it. There aren't as many factors pushing back. They often they're not able to test as much. And so they have a kind of outsider artist's purity, in part just because they don't have the resources to know how they were wrong, and they can't focus test it really. They show it to a few people they care about, and then it's out. And so it succeeds or fails based on something private that they brought to it that the world couldn't have seen coming. Obviously there are AAA games that have something personal to offer. And, I think you could argue that the folks working on The Last of Us are putting a lot of themselves into the project, and their core directorial team hasn't changed in a while. And so the likelihood is that there's more trickling into that. And the writing is not as far from the central management. Oftentimes in games, the writers are not very involved with the core of the thing. And so if it has a story, people are going to say, why isn't the story more personal? And it's often because the writer was a contractor, involved remotely, involved too late, and given no power.
Yeah.
Whereas some of the games that do feel kind of personal often don't have a story at all because the core development team is expressing something through mechanics. I think the core people behind Journey had something very beautiful to say about age and cooperation and legacy, but they didn't just come out and say it in words. They expressed it through an experience, and I feel I'm sure they would say that game was personal.
Yeah. So going back with Infinite, you came back to Irrational and collaborated again on that game. What was different making it Infinite for you, who went to make a sequel without Kim before that? What was different this time, and how was the experience overall?
I mean, it was vindicating in a way because they were having many of the same problems that we had. That follow-up pressure, the desire to say something new, but to touch on franchise tropes, to service fans without becoming slaves to them. I think even more so than BioShock, it was trying to walk this line of social commentary through this, very racist, nationalistic imagery that Comstock and his people were supposed to embody.
Yeah. And
to walk the line where the player understood that it was satire, that the game wasn't itself racist propaganda, that incredibly hard to do. It took several, incarnations to get to the point where people could even see the antagonists as wrong. And then a lot of us felt that they were too obviously wrong, right? One of the things about Andrew Ryan was that, and Andrew Ryan has not aged well in some ways, but at the time that BioShock 1 was released, a lot of people felt sympathetic to Ryan, right? That the idea that the Ayn Randian ideas that he was espousing had some merit. Now, I would argue that even in their purest form, Rand had many problems. But Andrew Ryan, there's a lot of folks who were kind of Thanos did nothing wrong style thinkers about him. And we all found that a little bit amusing because he was obviously pretty corrupt and hypocritical if you really paid attention. But whereas with Comstock, he was like the racist stuff was so repugnant that it was hard for anybody to try to infuse him with sympathy. We struggled with that some. And then there was all the quantum physics stuff, right? And so the game just had lots and lots and lots of ideas and extremely high production value and a much larger team. And showing up at first, I was like, oh, wow, no, it's just as hard as we thought, right? Anybody trying to follow up BioShock 1 in any capacity is going to find themselves with a unique series of problems. And oh boy, there was a lot to do. And so I became kind of a figure in the shadows. I was working with all of the team members and trying to help them speak a common language with Ken and make sure that both they and he were getting what they needed to out of a given piece of content or a feature. And I played the game constantly and tried to make up for lost time. I was only on it for about a year. The team members were very complimentary and seemed to indicate that I helped them a lot. But I didn't make a level. I was kind of involved with everything at that point. I helped cut multiplayer. And one of my very best friends is the guy who was on the multiplayer component. And we talked about it a lot. And we realized that he had some of the best designers on the team on that component. And we desperately needed them on the main game. It wasn't going to be good enough without them. And it was painful because what his vision for the multiplayer was really cool. But we got through it and ultimately, there's been a lot of very interesting and I think well thought through critique of BioShock Infinite. But all I can say is, good Lord, it could have been so much worse. It was just a hard task for everybody involved.
So after Infinite, you started your own studio with some of your old friends, and it's called Question Games. So what was the decision behind that?
Well, I think I was becoming slowly disenchanted with the idea of the thinking man's shooter. And I mean that in as clearly as I possibly can. We were making games for 25 to 45-year-old men usually, and they were almost always involved tons and tons of murder, and we were awkwardly trying to bolt onto them high-minded ideals and philosophy and emotional intimacy and all these things that are rendered a little bit absurd by the following explosion. Each time somebody says grenade, moments after you're supposed to have had your heart broken. And it was fine. I can't pretend that I didn't spend many years of my career doing that. And I'm not trying to say that anybody was wrong for having worked on one, but I was just feeling kind of over it. And several of my friends had moved on. David Pittman, who now works with us, had made Eldritch, which I thought was lovely, and it was just his own vision. It's still a shooter, but it was sort of a silly, fun Cthulhu thing. And other friends of ours had gone on to do Gone Home, which was obviously as big a counterpoint to that as you could possibly imagine. And they made it seem possible to start your own company. And at that time, it still was. But what we didn't know is that the indie bubble had already sort of burst financially. But that said, we were ready to make something about as far from a BioShock as you could. And so Stephen Alexander and I, who had worked together on the first game, he was at Irrational the whole time, even while I was gone. We worked together on the first game and gotten along really, really well. We worked on the intro and on Fort Frolic and a bunch of other sequences. And then I came back on Infinite, and we just picked up the friendship right where it left off, and made a lot of things work that otherwise wouldn't have, and realized that we could build something together. He had made fan maps from Thief 3, an editor that I pushed to have released to the community, and he showed me what he made during BioShock 1 and just blew me away. And it was just like instant friends. And so we started the company, and at that time it was just us. We kicked around this idea of a satire of game development called the Magic Circle. And it was going to be it was meant to look like it was, even though it was in 3D, it had been drawn on a whiteboard. The whole thing was supposed to feel sketch-like, and so he was doing visual tests, and we got off to the races, and we were using Unity, and Unity is really fun, but also you don't have access to the source code, so it can be a challenge sometimes. And we were trying to use a visual scripting language to make this game, and boy, it was technically pretty rickety. And then Kane Shin, who I'd worked with previously on Thief 3 and then Startup after that, joined us and kind of saved our asses.
Yeah, so
he's the third co-owner now.
Great. So you made Magic Circle, which was the first game in the new studio, and it's such a, as you said, odd game to start a company with. So what was the decision behind making that game as the first game for the company?
Honestly, I think it was just a naive desire for contrast. We wanted to do something that was light of heart. And I pitched several other things which were closer to the Blackout Club, and I pitched them to Steven, like, here's the stuff I've been thinking of. Here's the because he doesn't necessarily want to own the pitching process. He much prefers to help make a vision better. Rarely is he the guy who says, I've got this game I've always wanted to make, and here it is. I don't think I've ever heard him say that. So I fell into my natural role, which is like, okay, well, we could do this or this or this or this. And the thing that really sparked for him was this comedy, this very deeply meta comedy, because he loves the movies that have done that in the past, right? And they used to say that, one of the ways to bait an Oscar is to make a movie about making movies, right? Because that's the life that actors and directors connect with. Obviously it doesn't mean that it's a slam dunk, and there's a lot of bad movies about making movies also, but we still felt like there wasn't much like that in games. There were a few cases, of satirical games at the time, but not a lot. And so, yeah, and I love the idea of a voice cast that had comic gifts, and so, we got James Urbaniak, who does Dr. Venture, and Ashley Birch, who's just amazing in everything, and it was really. It felt completely liberating to make that game. We're very lucky. His parents were, willing to give us a place to work and this kind of thing. There's a lot of spousal privilege, granted to us. We didn't have funding or anything like that, so it was very much like our own savings and the grace of our partners.
Yeah. So after that, you made the Blackout Club. We talked about personal games. I think this game is your most personal game. It deals with horror, stealth, childhood, and some D&D vibes in the storytelling. But I think, thinking about it now, it's kind of a personal game for everyone because it's about growing up, looking for adventures, mixing that with an online co-op game. It works like an awesome time machine, I guess. So talk about the initial idea of making this game the way it is.
As far back as 2006, I was building what I thought might be a tabletop universe called Deep Structures, and it was about the way the brain is constructed, and if you could turn the architecture of your mind into a space, and it was very bleak and horrific, and it was about not kids but adults dealing with these voices in their heads that some claimed to be gods, some said that they were older and simpler than gods, and their structures, their molecules of meaning, and they had learned to speak and they wanted things. And part of the point was that you wouldn't really understand if everyone was just, undergoing some kind of dementia or if these were actual supernatural forces. And so I built my sort of setting Bible and was working on making it all feel real. And at that time I was living alone and I was plagued by nightmares and sleep problems, and I almost started to believe some of the ideas that it's based on, that the mind is made out of many lesser minds, basically, that are all at war with one another. And it was the kind of thing that a young man can indulge themselves in when there's nobody around to say like, hey, that's kind of out there. But it certainly, believing it helped me develop the universe even further, and then I had to put it on ice because other opportunities came up, and the people who I was talking about it with, we lost connection for a while, and after the Magic Circle, we had to figure out something that we felt like intersected between our tastes as game developers and creatives and what we thought would actually sell. And multiplayer games seem to be doing well. Games with some procedural elements seem to be doing well. And horror finally seemed to be doing well again after years of people telling me that horror games don't sell.
Yeah.
And so we were fans of various games like The Forest and stuff like that, and thought, okay, well, we can do something along those lines. And it can be movement-centric for Kane, and it can be multiplayer, for Steven, and it can have horror elements for me, and it can have live performance, which had never been done before. The gods are played by live actors in the Blackout Club, and that I don't, as far as I know, there's nothing ever really truly been like it, and I've always wanted to do that, and so this universe that I developed long ago, I updated it, and at some point we realized that that we didn't want to make a heavy action game with lots of fighting and combat, and so to help enforce the sheer vulnerability, to remind people that they're not, the protagonist of a power fantasy, we thought, okay, what about kids in this town without cellular signal in the National Radio Quiet Zone, which is a real place in the States. The fictional town, but a real phenomenon. and because of the Green Bank radio telescope, and it just clicked. That all made sense to people, and South Park, who I'd consulted with in the meantime, have always, I don't know, they've always just trusted me, I guess, when it comes to games. We worked together on their 2 RPGs, and they felt that I made them better, and so they gave us the funding to make the Blackout Club, and which is incredibly generous. We owe them pretty much everything, and it goes to show you that the ideas worked for them, because it's not comedy. It's not linked to anything you would necessarily imagine associated with South Park, but they liked it, and they loved the live theater mechanic. And so we were off to the races, and so that idea that you asked about back in 2006, finally got updated and made more sense for the now. And arguably, it's much better now than it was back then. It's more relevant, I think, because we're seeing people claim to be able to manipulate the beliefs of the world through social media and do so with a straight face.
Yeah. So, are you happy with the reception of the game?
I mean, it's the most heartwarming reception we've ever had. It's a cult hit, but still has a very strong audience. They just happen to be very hardcore. I would have loved for the game to make enough money to make an entire other sequel on its own, but it's done much better than the Magic Circle, and I see that as an improvement, and I'm happy about it.
Great. You think you ever come back to linear single player games?
I don't know. I mean, it honestly, where we are right now feels like that would be a vanity project. I'd basically have to have a pile of money from something else to spend on that, with no exception of getting it back. Because right now, if you sell one of those games with a few very specific exceptions, people say, oh, it's too short. Oh, I'll wait for a rental. Oh, I'll wait till it's on sale. And it's just not sustainable. You need something that's going to deep engage them. And our gamble was that multiplayer would get them to actually buy it now when it's at full price and the community is there. And that was true, by the way, to an extent. I love single player games, and the intro to the Blackout Club is what I would do more of that in that same universe, but single player and lonely and scary, if I could afford it. But it'll be a long time before I feel like we'd be financially comfortable enough to indulge in that way with, again, no expectation of return.
Yeah. So what was the last inspiring game you played?
Ooh, inspiring?
Yep.
I'd say probably Sea of Thieves. There's many games that I find inspiring by some degree, but Sea of Thieves, like whenever we were underway and set sail, and anything could happen, I get that old sense that I got that we talked about at the beginning of this interview, but when on the PC Junior with the first Sierra games, like this is magical. I can't believe this works. Where could I go? How much is hidden? There is a whimsy and an immersion to it that I haven't felt in much else. I think about it pretty often as man, I'd love to make something like that. Like one of the pitches that we didn't get a chance to finish at 2K had a little bit of flavor of the sea. I'd still love to do it someday.
Yeah. So what's the game you can't wait to play?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I'm super looking forward to the new Path of Exile League, and especially Path of Exile 2 when they officially call it Path of Exile 2. I'm the lead designer at Question, and I play all the time Path of Exile. But what else is coming out that I'm psyched about? I'm interested in Cyberpunk, certainly. And I like that. I want to play that. It's literally just mowing. Have you seen that? It's just a little mobile game about mowing the lawn, and it looks beautiful and satisfying. And when I watch somebody play it, I can smell the grass. They obviously have that slightly obsessive pleasure that I did getting the lawn just right when I was a kid. Like I wasn't a kid who liked any other kind of chore, but for some reason mowing the lawn felt good.
So you're a horror fan, just like me. So what's your favorite horror films and games?
Oh boy. Well, films, definitely Silence of the Lambs. Some people say it's more suspense, but I like how deep it goes into the nature of what turns a person like that. I think that it does so much with so little that I'll always go to that one first. Games, I want to remake Eternal Darkness. I want them to give me that franchise.
Oh, man,
I would rock that game.
Yeah.
It's a huge inspiration, and the way in which that game for its time broke the fourth wall it certainly inspired me to do what we do in the Blackout Club, which is to have the game kind of talk back to you and to use your name and this kind of stuff. And so I would, that's a big one. Obviously, System Shock 2, as I mentioned, particularly the cooperative patch that came out later. I played through the whole thing with a friend, and it was changed my life. Silent Hill 2, like a lot of people say, I can't pretend that wasn't massively influential. It was. It's still with me now. But also Fatal Frame. Damn, Fatal Frame 2.
Man, yeah.
I still remember a moment that I've talked about this before, but a moment that may or may not have just been a weird buggy camera thing, but it's you're walking with your twin sister very early in the abandoned village, and then suddenly you realize she's not with you, and you go back to find her, and she's just standing there frozen, looking at something that you can't see because of the door frame, and it just that nailed it for me, because it was that perfect defiance of expectations where I thought it was just, I lost the dumb AI, but no, it was a moment.
How about those Outlast games?
Not for me. I think the production value of them is amazing, but that's kind of more heavy metal take on horror, like lots of blood and guts and scars and stuff like that. I respect the team. That's a cool vision, but my horror tends to be more psychological. And to show a lot less of the monster, and I know it's hard to do, but but by contrast, I love The Forest, and The Forest has its horror front and center, and in part, it's just how realistic it feels. I think that the horror of those people's kind of psychotic nude rampage gets to me more than like somebody who's like obviously carved on themselves or whatever. Like it's just kind of more. My brain has fewer defenses against something that feels like it might happen. Now, granted, they also have giant monsters made of limbs in the forest, but most of your experience is not with those. That's the spice.
All right. Last thing. I'm a video game composer and sound designer. Give me a tip to score horror and creepy atmospheres better.
My tip is so I would just say exploit the difference threshold, which is and you may already know about this, but it's a psychological principle that suggests that if you make incremental enough changes, the human mind lacks the capacity to notice. And so you can slowly increase the volume on people in a room and they won't notice, even though it's gotten to the point where it's actually hurting them.
Yeah.
And so if you're going to add creepy elements, start out with something that seems completely mundane, and then add the tension, the vocals, or the sort of warped sounding stuff as slowly as you possibly can. And what they will feel themselves becoming uneasy before they realize that the music is doing the work.
Yeah. So, Jordan, thank you so much. If it was up to me, I could have talked to you forever, but I know you got awesome games to make, so we got to finish this. Thank you for all the experiences, and I can't wait to play your next game, and congratulations on everything you're doing.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you for your time. It's a good chat.
Yeah. Thank you very much.